Today, we're going to tackle a question that, honestly, it seems to defy all logic. Why would an innocent person confess to a crime they had absolutely nothing to do with? It sounds impossible, right? Well, let's dive in. I mean, really think about it. It's a genuine puzzle. Our entire justice system and just our own gut feeling places so much weight on a confession. It feels like the ultimate proof of guilt, the final word. But what if that whole idea is flawed? And this is exactly why it's such a huge deal. For decades, legal experts have known how powerful a confession is. I mean, this quote from way back in 1972 says it all. Once a jury hears a confession, pretty much everything else, all the other evidence, it just kind of fades into the background. It's that definitive.
But here's a number that really complicates things. A staggering statistic, really. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, these are the folks who track wrongful convictions. 13% of people who were later proven totally innocent had, at one point, confessed to the crime. So that tells us that while a confession is powerful, it is definitely not always the truth.
So, to understand how this can even happen, we have to go behind the closed doors of the interrogation room. And you have to realize, this isn't just a simple Q&A. No. It's a carefully designed, high-pressure environment, and it's specifically built to get a confession. The situation itself holds an incredible amount of power. A lot of psychological interrogations follow a kind of three-act play. First up is isolation. The suspect is taken away from everything they know, which immediately cranks up their anxiety and makes them feel helpless. Then comes the confrontation. Interrogators don't ask if the suspect did it. They come in hot, insisting that they did. And finally, there's minimization. This is the part where they make confessing seem like the only logical, maybe even the best, way out of this whole mess. Now, a key tool in that confrontation stage is something researchers call the false evidence ploy. And this is wild. Police are legally allowed to lie. They can tell a suspect they have rock-solid evidence, that they failed a lie detector test, that there's an eyewitness, that they have their DNA, even when none of it exists. Imagine you're innocent. That would be incredibly disorienting. It could even make you question what you remember.
And the devastating result of these tactics is right here in this one just heartbreaking quote. After hours and hours of interrogation where police lied to him about evidence, 14-year-old Michael Crow, who is innocent, became so confused and so broken down that he said these words. He didn't know how, but he actually became convinced he was guilty.
Now let's factor in time. While lots of interrogations are pretty short, when you look at the documented cases of false confessions, you see a really disturbing pattern. The average length of questioning was over 16 hours. That is more than 2 full workdays of nonstop, intense psychological pressure, usually without any real rest. Sheer exhaustion becomes a weapon.
Okay, so we've seen how the situation itself is basically a pressure cooker. But the outcome also really depends on who is in that chair, because some people are just far more susceptible to this kind of pressure than others.
And kids are particularly at risk. Psychologically, they're just wired differently. They are much more likely to just go along with what an authority figure says. They often don't truly get what their rights are, and their brains are way more open to suggestion, especially when an adult in a uniform is telling them they have irrefutable evidence.
And the risk goes way beyond just age. People with intellectual disabilities or certain mental illnesses can have a really hard time dealing with the stress and the trickiness of an interrogation. And then you've got personality traits. People who are naturally highly suggestible or have a strong desire to just avoid conflict, they're more likely to give the interrogators what they want just to make the pressure stop.
Okay, so we've got a coercive situation and vulnerable people. But how do those two things actually come together to create a confession? Well, to really solve this paradox, psychologists have sorted false confessions into 3 very distinct types. First up is the rarest, and honestly, maybe the strangest type, the voluntary false confession. This is when someone confesses without any police pressure at all. Sometimes they just walk right into the station. The reasons why are all over the map. A weird need for fame, a misguided attempt to protect somebody else, or even a severe mental illness that just blurs the line between what's real and what's not.
A perfect example of this is John Mark Carr. You might remember this. He confessed to the infamous JonBenet Ramsey murder, and it caused a huge media storm. But the whole thing just fell apart. His story was full of holes, his DNA was not a match, and it turned out he wasn't even in the state at the time. It was a confession that came purely from his own imagination.
All right, the second type is way more common. It's called the compliant false confession. And this one, it's all about calculation. The innocent person knows they didn't do it,
But the short-term benefit of confessing, to finally go home, to get some sleep, to just make the yelling stop, it seems to outweigh the long-term consequences. It is an act of pure surrender to a situation that feels totally unbearable.
The case of the Central Park Five is just a tragic, famous example of this. After interrogations that lasted anywhere from 14 to 30 hours, 5 teenagers, all of them innocent, confessed. They took it back almost immediately, but by then it was too late. They confessed for one reason: to escape the crushing pressure of that room, believing it was their only ticket out.
And finally, we have what might be the most psychologically mind-bending type, the internalized false confession. In this case, the interrogation is so powerful that it doesn't just change what the suspect says, it changes what they actually believe. When a vulnerable person is fed lies and false evidence, their own memory becomes so flexible that they start to think they could have, or maybe even did, commit the crime.
This is exactly what happened to a kid named Peter Riley. After police falsely told the 18-year-old that he failed a polygraph test, he got deeply, deeply confused. His trust in his own memory just shattered. And under suggestion from the police, he actually created a brand new, false memory of killing his own mother. He internalized their lie and became his own accuser.
Okay, so understanding how this nightmare happens is the first step. The next, and most important step, is figuring out what we can do about it. How can the justice system protect innocent people from these powerful psychological forces and find a better path to the actual truth?
A huge part of the solution is bringing science into the courtroom. Forensic psychologists can act as interpreters. They can look at the whole context of a confession, analyze the tactics that were used, check the suspect for any hidden vulnerabilities, and give the court a scientific way to decide if a confession is actually reliable.
And based on decades of this research, those experts have offered a really clear roadmap for reform. It starts with something simple: transparency. Record every single second of every interrogation, no exceptions. It also means protecting people from exhaustion by putting time limits on questioning. Crucially, it means banning the tactic of lying about evidence and shifting from trying to force a confession to actually gathering information. And finally, it means giving extra legal protections to kids and other vulnerable people. So we're left with this really profound challenge. We've built so much of our idea of justice around the power of a confession. But knowing how easily that power can be twisted, how it can literally lead an innocent person to say they're guilty, it forces us to ask a much, much bigger question. What does the path to real justice actually look like?